Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott McCammon, President and CEO of the Milton Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to COVID Conversations, what we're calling members helping members, because we know a lot of people in the Milton business community have a lot of questions about what's going on related to COVID-19, and we also know we have a lot of experts in our membership, so we thought we would leverage the expertise of our membership to help the business community. And one of those experts is Katherine Jensen, who very kindly agreed to join us today to talk about commercial leases, a subject that I know it has a lot of question marks around it for people. So just a little bit about Katherine. She spent almost a decade immersed in the world of real estate and corporate legal administration. But then she decided after the commute became too much in 2017 to launch her own consulting firm, which is Jensen Consulting. And she now offers expertise as a consultant to help landlords and tenants across North America. And that includes many national brands. So we're very lucky to have Katherine joining us to talk about the struggles that people are having with rental reductions and things like that, and dealing with their landlords. Just understanding what is possible under this pandemic. As we all know, the federal government has made some announcements around leases, and so all the details are still to come to a great extent. We'll try and touch on some of those this morning as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Katherine. Thank you.
Hi, guys. I'm excited to be here, and I'm happy to, turn this into a Q&A session if there's lots of questions. So feel free to use the question Q&A button, send in your questions, and then I'll try and answer them live. So Scott has told you a little bit about me, what I've been working on for the last month or so since this COVID crisis hit is I've got some larger tenants that have over 100 locations with 25 locations that are under construction right now, and just dealing with a variety of the bigger landlords and smaller landlords, and kind of finding our way through the construction process that's obviously been delayed, and how our other stores are going to cope, food courts that had to completely close and things like that. So that's what I've been doing on the tenant side. On the landlord side, same thing, but from the landlord's angle. So I'm understanding what the landlords are able to give, what they're looking for. So I thought that's really important information to share with you guys. Yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them and I'll try and get them answered, and then we'll run through this presentation. So the first thing, a lot of people reach out to me and they don't have anything signed. So if you don't have a lease signed, you're going to have to look to the Commercial Tenancies Act to answer all your questions about the what ifs. The great thing about commercial leasing that's very different from residential leasing is you can contract outside of the act. So if you have a strong lease, the terms of that lease govern what's going to happen. So most strong leases have something called a force majeure clause, or sometimes it's titled impossibility of performance. And that's the clause that talks about, okay, we've got all these rights and responsibilities that have to be maintained throughout the term of the lease. So you have to be open, you have to be operating, things like that. But if something happens outside of your control, then you don't need to do that. Like, the landlord can't force you to open and operate when there's things outside of your control that have happened preventing that. So I'm just going to run through a few examples of force majeure clauses that were found in a variety of different leases. So this one here, it talks about if either party, so that's always very important, landlords write these leases, typically it's landlord favorable. So you want to make sure that this talks about either party and not just what happens to the landlord. If you're delayed or prevented from performing any act under the lease because of strikes, lockout, labor trouble, so that's what we're going through right now because people are prevented from working, inability to procure materials, Also, we're dealing with a lot of supply chain issues right now. Restrictive governmental laws or regulations. So that's what would come into play when we're talking about, when we're talking about the shutdown regulations that the provinces and the federal government have put in place. So for instance, our food court tenants, there's no way they can operate because all the malls are shut down, right? And then the bottom of it says, then the performance of such act shall be excused for the period of delay. So for the time frame that COVID is restricting you, basically. So this is a great clause if you're in construction right now and you need to expand your fixturing period because you can't get labor and material and things like this, that this will help you, right? The next clause, you know, tenants aren't going to be happy to see this one, and it might be in your lease, and it makes it very clear that even if force majeure happens, rent is still due and payable. So that's what people are having a very hard time coming to terms with right now, because they're not open, they can't be open, they don't have any source of income, but rent is still due. So how do we make ends meet? So again, this talks about restrictive governmental laws or regulations, and even though this section talks about excusing performance, it's not excusing you from the payment of rent. So this was another example about a force majeure clause, again, titled differently. And the fun thing that happens in complicated leases is you have defined terms and then you have to look back to the definition section. So this force majeure clause was very small, unavoidable delay. So if either party is delayed or hindered by reason of unavoidable delay, then the performance of such obligation is excused, but again, you're not excused from paying rent. So then you need to go and look up what does unavoidable delay mean. And it talks about here, again, restrictive governmental rules, strike, lockout, labor troubles, etc. So that's just showing you sometimes they're not always called force majeure, and sometimes you have to go on a scavenger hunt throughout the lease to find exactly what the whole clause is talking about. So this was a very interesting and scary one that we found. You know, typically force majeure clause was just boilerplate standard clause that was in all the leases. You got what you got, and that wasn't something that you focused on. Now times have changed and we're really focusing on those clauses. And when you look at this one, it talks about if such delay extends for a period of 60 consecutive days or more, the parties who right to perform under this lease had been delayed, then they can terminate. So a termination right under the lease is huge. This would be great for you if your landlord isn't agreeable to giving any rent concessions, you can't pay the rent, and you know what? I'm just going to have to terminate the lease. Because the scary thing about the lease is you sign a 5-year lease, you owe the landlord for those 5 years. You've committed to those 5 years unless you have a built-in termination right. So if you default, courts have found that although yes, the landlord needs to mitigate their damages, but you do owe them for that period that you had committed to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what to do if you're in the midst of negotiating a new lease with a landlord right now. You know, I'm sure a lot of people are scared and they're not, but I do have clients that are negotiating leases right now because, you know, it's a tenant's market. So they're getting some good terms, but we do need to look at some different clauses, right? So things that we're adding now to the force majeure clause, we're making sure that we're talking about communicable diseases and epidemics and pandemics and health emergencies, because now for the first time we've realized how much that really does impact our ability to perform. Then also, you know, making sure that we're talking about any regulation made by the government. So when they jump in and enforce some sort of lockdown, then it's not hindering us in any way, and it's included in our force majeure clause. And then, you know, this is the huge ask, and I have yet to anyone completely agree to it, but you know, there's no harm in asking. That's what the point of negotiations are. Any amount due on account of rent shall be abated and shall not later be payable, right? Because there's a big difference between an abatement and a deferral. You know, start strong, saying, you know, we don't need to pay the rent, and you might negotiate into a deferral or something like that. So those are kind of the three things that you want to think about and make sure in your force majeure or unavoidable delay or impossibility of performance clause, whatever it's called, if you are in the process of negotiating a new lease. Like, once a lease is signed, you can't renegotiate terms unless both parties are agreeable to it. But if you are mid-negotiation, this is a great thing to think about. So now we get on to what I'm sure all of the attendees are here for. How can I convince my landlord to give me some free rent and help me out during this awful time? And I understand it from both sides because I've got clients on both sides, right? Like, landlords have obligations, they've got mortgages that they have to pay, they've got other bills, other contracts that have been signed, and expenses that just aren't going away. So it's not as easy for them just to say, you don't have to pay any rent. So, you know, things that I've been seeing from most of the landlords and steps that you can take to get a more favorable response for them, you know, start with showing your sales. So most, you know, AAA tier centers landlords, they demand that you report sales on a monthly basis. So those landlords will already know what your sales are and see the drop and understand what pressures you're under. But if you have a landlord that you have never reported sales to, they might not understand how drastically this is impacting your business. So gather, you know, whatever you feel comfortable sharing with them, and you know, whether it's month over month or if it's you know, sales from last year and sales from this year, and just illustrate to them how drastically your business has been impacted, right? The next area that, you know, it might seem fruitless because I think we all already know the answer, but you do need to give your insurance broker a call and see if there is any part of your policy that could help you out during this time. So most leases mandate that you have business interruption insurance, which most people would think, yeah, my business has been interrupted, give me my insurance. There's actually a few cases that have started, one out in Saskatchewan, where they're suing the insurance company, saying, of course, this is what business interruption insurance is for. Why are you not paying out on these policies? But the initial response for the majority of them have been no, but still make that call, get that response so that you can put it together with the information package you're going to give to your landlord. The third thing is do your due diligence and look for any remedies that you can get. So if you are a franchisee, a lot of franchisors have set up different ways to help you, whether it's waiving royalty payments. I know one of my franchisor clients has actually set up a fund for his franchisees that are really struggling and to not get the assistance from the landlords that we're hoping for. There are a lot of government grants and things like that that have been announced in the past few weeks. So show that you applied for them or show that you're ineligible to apply for them and why. You know, just easily paint the picture for the landlord so that you have tried and you have done everything you can do, and this is the last resort. And then the final thing, and this is more of a proactive measure in case the landlord hasn't looked into it for themselves, check with your municipality. Most municipalities are deferring the property tax payment, and most leases are composed of minimum rent, CAM, and property taxes. And you have 3 different payments. So if your lease is set up in a way where you're just paying a flat gross rental amount, $2,500 a month plus HST or something like that, even though it's not illustrated in the document, it's known that part of that payment is going towards the landlord's property taxes, part's going towards the mortgage, and hopefully part is a little bit of income for him. So if part of that is to pay property taxes, and the landlord is getting the benefit of a deferred property tax, then you should try and get that benefit as well. So check with the municipality, confirm that they are deferring the property taxes. If your lease is set up in a way that you know the exact portion that is attributable to property taxes, then you're golden. Send the letter, say, you know, my property tax payment, I'd like to defer it until September or whenever it is that the municipality has deferred that payment. And then what that means is you then pay that in September, right? So it's giving you some time to catch your breath, and hopefully on the other side of this, you'll have enough sales that that deferred payment won't be a hardship. So the three things that you can ask for once you've gathered this information is either a rent abatement, a rent deferral, or additional rent deferrals. So a rent abatement is a complete abatement of the rent. So as with any good negotiation, you have to have some give and take. If you're expecting the landlord to just completely forgive your rent, congratulations if they do and you have a really great landlord, but most are in a situation where they have tenants to pay their bills. So they don't have any option but to collect rent. So find a way that you can give them something else that they need. So something else that landlords need is commitment on term. So if you are getting to the end of the lease, you are planning on exercising your extension option, you know, next year and committing for another 5 years, talk to them about doing that now and getting a couple of months free rent now to help you through this hard period. So I've got one landlord that we've done a few deals like that, where the tenant was supposed to renew, or the termination of the lease was next year. So we assumed they were going to renew. They've been there for years and years. They are interested in renewing. They don't think that this is going to kill them. So what we did was agreed to give them 2 free months now to get them through this hardship once they committed to an additional 5-year term. So doing things like that is a great way for a little bit of give and take. And now when the landlord goes to mortgage the center or something like that, they've got a stronger commitment with their tenants, and that's always looked more favorable from the bank, right? So the other one that you can ask for is a rent deferral. So what a rent deferral means is you can't pay it now, but you will pay it at some point over the term. So if what you need to figure out is how much help you need now and how much you'll be able to afford after this is over. So for instance, if you ask, so I did a little scenario here. Assume your rent is $1,200 a month and your lease is expiring in a couple years. You could ask for the 2 free months now, so that's about $2,400, and then they divide that over the remaining term of the lease. So starting in September, because fingers crossed I need the kids to go back to school, September we will be all back in business and flourishing because everyone is going to be, you know, going out twice as much and buying twice as much as they did before. So you're going to have that extra money to pay for rent. So starting in September, if we amortize the $2,400 over the remaining period of the term from September to May, that's an extra $72.75 if they're not asking for any interest on the deferred payment. They might ask for some interest on the deferred payment, and why not? It's technically a loan, right? So if there isn't any interest, then your regular monthly payment was $1,200. Now it's $1,272.75. Not a terrible increase. You know, you're probably going to be able to make that payment, but you're not able to make the $1,200 payment right now when you're not open and you have nothing coming in. So play around with the numbers, you know, your rent, how many months rent free you need, the term that's remaining in your lease, how long you can amortize those payments over, you know, throw a couple % interest on it too, to see if you can handle that, so that you can prepare yourself when you're negotiating with the landlord. And this is, you know, where most of the deals are landing, in the rent deferral arena, because the landlord gets all their money. If they're charging interest on it, it's because they've got a mortgage that they are getting charged interest on, so they're just passing that through, and then you're able to get through this hardship. And presumably on the other side of this, there's going to be a big boom in business, so you know the extra $72 isn't going to be a hardship, not the hardship that the $1,200 is right now. So that's kind of an illustration of how rent deferrals work. Sometimes they want the money paid over, you know, 5 months or over a year, or they might do it over the remaining term. Like, that's all part of the negotiations that that you need to have with your landlord. But do the calculations first, so that you can go into that conversation prepared. And then the other one that is an easy ask and a reasonable ask is for the additional rent deferrals. So again, if your lease is made up of minimum rent, property taxes, and common area expenses, CAM or TMI, whatever it's called in your particular lease, then those things are noticeably being reduced. The property taxes, like we talked about before, are being deferred. So it makes sense to ask your landlord to pass those benefits on to you as well. And if you have one of those leases that are made up of CAM and taxes, you'll be familiar with getting year-end statements, right? So your CAM number is just an estimate, and it gets trued up at the end of the year. So if you're really struggling right now, we know that additional rent is probably going to decrease in some way. There's a lot less that's going on in the plaza, so the utilities are lower. We've seen, you know, on automobile policies, the insurance has been reduced. So I'm not sure what other kind of insurance reductions might be coming. And just different things like that, that if you look at all the expenses in the common expense line, they're going to be lower than anticipated. So, you know, what you could do is ask for the portion of your payment that is allocated towards CAM to defer that until year end, and pay that once the reconciliation happens, because perhaps there would have been money owed to you, but now since you didn't make those payments, you know, there's a little bit of catch-up payment that you'll have to make at year end. So look at your center, and depending on the amount of costs that are reduced, for example, if you're in an enclosed mall, they are all shut down, their CAM is going to drastically drop, right? They're not running the utilities, they don't need as much security, all that kind of stuff. The washrooms aren't getting used, especially if you're in a food court, your food court CAM cost, that's definitely going to be dropping. So that would be an appropriate thing to ask for a deferral for a few months, and then do the catch up at year end. So that is all I have to blabber on about. If anyone has any specific questions, I'm happy to try and answer them about your deal specifically, or about something I talked about in the slides. Or if you just want to send me an email, feel free. I can't promise I'll get back to you right away, but I will do my best to get back to everyone who has any questions.
Thank you very much, Katherine. So for any of the attendees, if you do have any questions, we'd like you to post them in the Q&A section so Katherine can see them, and she can either answer them live or text an answer to everybody. And it looks like we have one question, Katherine.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so everyone else can see the questions, right? So I'm not going to read them out, but it is frustrating that when you have no income and your landlord's requiring you to pay rent. What I've heard from my broker friends in the industry is this is a tenants market. On the other side of this, it's going to be a huge tenants market, and it already is. So the landlords need tenants, and they should be working with you to help you through this hardship. You know, if you get forced into bankruptcy because of this, they're going to have a vacancy, and now they're not going to have anybody paying the rent. So I would suggest, you know, go back to them with kind of the 4 things that I talked about, and try and negotiate from that angle. Okay, what trends are you noticing with the concerns from tenants who are struggling to pay rent? Our rents generally still due. What I've seen is a lot of landlords are willing to make concessions and help. So even, you know, the landlords that I work with are smaller landlords. They only have a couple shopping centers, but even the big guys like First Capital and RioCan and things like that, they are making efforts to help tenants through this, because they know they don't want vacancies on the other side of this. Vacancies are worse than getting 50% of your rent. So when you go prepared with those 4 things that I kind of talked about, the landlord's very happy to help you through this. But just kind of calling them and crying on the phone and saying, you know, I can't pay rent, that's not helpful. And I'll give you one example of, and I've heard it from several different landlords now. There's a particular sandwich chain that took a very aggressive stance of, we are not paying rent, we are going to give you X% of our sales, and that is it. They did nothing to help the franchisees through with their royalties or setting up a fund or anything like that. The landlords just laughed at them. Your rent is due. And that's the hard thing, because you're in a contract, your rent is due, especially if you have one of those force majeure clauses that said, doesn't matter if there's a pandemic, your rent is still due. You took out business interruption insurance hoping that that would cover you, and now everyone's kind of in limbo. So I don't have a magic answer of say X, Y, and Z and landlord's going to forgive your rent, but it's just kind of setting yourself up in the best light. So do you have any information about the planned help from provincial government with regards to commercial rents? So what I've seen so far is that they are asking that they've given, I think it's, I don't know the exact amount, but there's a loan that landlords can apply for, and the government's essentially hoping that they will then, you know, defer the rents or abate the rents and use that loan to cover. And I believe 25% of that loan is forgivable as long as you make the payments and all that. So I'm not sure it's the best system. Like, I think if you're doing something to help tenants, then do it to help tenants. Don't do it to help landlords and assume that they're going to do the right thing. Because from what I've seen, there's nothing that's requiring them to abate rents when they take the loan or anything like that. So I'm not sure what's coming, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure. One thing that's actually is kind of scaring me during this time is when I'm reviewing a lot of leases, a new clause that's popping up all the time is something that asks the tenant to waive the rights or benefits of future legislation that might come into play. Again, one of those boilerplate clauses that just kind of gets thrown in and people glaze over. But we've been fighting hard to take that out. Why would you waive rights to something that you don't even know is in place? And now my train of thought is, well, what if the government puts in some sort of legislation that, you know, says tenants are owed a little bit of a break here during this pandemic or something like that. We don't know what's coming. But if you had a clause in your lease that waived any future rights or future legislation that came into play, then any legislation that came couldn't benefit you. So that's one of those clauses in leases that, you know, you're looking at it and you're thinking, when would this ever happen? And now it's happening. I think, you know, one thing that is really hard and, you know, people always get confused about is it's so different from residential, where you have the Residential Tenancies Act and it's there to really protect the tenants because this is their home. And, you know, although the landlords, it's a business for the landlords, it's not supposed to be as cutthroat as business as usual usually is. And then on the flip side, on the commercial end of it, you know, you can contract out of the act. Landlords are in a position where they have huge legal teams, complex leases, and independent tenants come in and, you know, don't have the wherewithal to understand exactly what they're signing, but then they're held accountable to the terms in that document. So that's why it's so important to have someone look over your lease and make sure that you understand what your lease says, make sure that you have a lease. Like it blows my mind how many of the businesses, you know, don't have leases. And you run into situations like this, and this is exactly when you want a document that talks about what happens. Okay, my landlord will defer my rent for 1 month, but wants to charge 5% interest on the deferral payment. Is that reasonable? So most leases will have in it a prescribed interest rate. So I would just make sure that that 5% is in line with whatever interest rate they talk about in the lease. And if it is, then that's what it is. I think probably check with some mortgage agents and see what the interest rate is on a commercial mortgage, and that would be the rate that I would probably be more happy to pay. You know, but I have seen them asking for interest on the deferral payment. But I also don't think that 1 month rent is really going to help the situation, right? Like I think negotiating kind of a longer period might be better, because, you know, we're not going to be out of this in a couple weeks, I don't think. What does business interruption insurance typically cover? Why not pandemic? Well, great question. So the force majeure clause that I talked about that we have in our leases that we as tenants would hopefully look to say we don't have to pay rent, that same clause is in the insurance policies. So the insurance companies are looking to that clause to say, force majeure, we don't have to pay you. I'm not an insurance expert. Actually, I'm going to do a webinar with one of my insurance friends, hopefully, and talk about that, because he actually went through and called, I think, about 8 or 9 different companies to get their take and their exact response. And I think it was only one of them that said, case by case, we'll review it. And the rest were just kind of flat out no. So if you want to Google merchant law group in Saskatchewan, they're the ones that are doing the class action suit. And so it's a great read if you like boring insurance stuff and talks about exactly what's going on there. What if none of these clauses are in my rental agreement? Yeah, so great question. And same thing, if you don't have a rental agreement, then you're always looking to the Commercial Tenancies Act to see if there's anything in there that talks about obligations on either party's behalf. And of course, there's nothing in there that talks about a pandemic like this. So if you don't have anything in your lease that dictates what's going to happen, then you have to negotiate in good faith with each other. I represent landlords, and most usually want to hire face rent and might be more inclined to amortize some rent over the remaining term. Yeah, exactly. There's lots of options to defer the rent and amortize it over the term. Like when you looked at my numbers there, you can see how it's a tiny little increase, but it's going to be a big help in the now, right? And so that's one thing that you want to think about too. If you are taking the position of let's negotiate our renewal early to get a couple months free rent, you never get anything for free. So they're always bumping up that base rent to include any of the inducements that they give you. So if you are in a position to extend your term, it's a great time to kind of do that and build the free rent that you need now into the back end of your lease.
If anyone has any more questions, we'd love to hear them.
Would there be a situation where you would recommend a tenant offer X months as a release to get out completely? Oh, all the time. So people are constantly calling me and saying, I need to get out of my rent or out of my lease. And typically leases do not have a termination option. So usually what you see is about 3 months rent is equal to the termination fee that the landlord asks for. I've seen some landlords ask for 3 months rent plus the cost of reletting the space. So the cost of reletting is commission if they've got a realtor, and any inducements that they give for the reletting. So if they give free rent, if they get a tenant improvement allowance or anything like that, then the tenant needs to pay that. So I always prefer seeing a flat rate because, you know, paying the landlord's costs could be extreme depending on what kind of tenant they get in there after the fact. So 3 months rent is usually typically what I see. When do we expect federal and provincial funding for landlords? Well, I think we've already seen a little bit of that come. I'm a landlord and expect that funds would support landlords for non-payment of rent. Yeah, so the one that I was looking at the other day, I want to say it was 40,000, but 40,000 doesn't seem like enough. Yeah, depending on what your employee payroll is, there was a range there. You can get the loan. You have to pay, it's interest free for a period. After that, there's interest. And if you pay 75% of it by a certain point, then the final 25% is forgiven. So I think, you know, it's might not be the perfect solution or enough money for everybody, but it'll help a little bit get through some of the hardships, I think. And would you normally, get some TI for the renewal, which you could convert into free rent? Yeah. So there's a starting rate that a landlord usually wants for minimum rent, and then any inducements that they give on top of that. So whether it's a tenant improvement allowance, which is a check that's cut after the tenant constructs their premise and gives receipts to show that they paid that much, or it could be free rent, so a couple months free rent, or it could be that the landlord's building out the space, so the cost for them to do that, all those kind of things, they end up building into the base rent. So you can ask for anything. I am a subtenant. Does the Commercial Tenancies Act still apply? Yes. Yeah. Subtenant, tenant, as long as you're in a commercial situation, that's the act that governs. Can a landlord be sued for evicting a tenant for non-payment of rent and it causes the tenant to go out of business? So that's very interesting. One of my good friends, Philip Millar at Millar's Law, he is one of those go-get-em lawyers. It's really fun to follow on Facebook. His answer to that would be hell yeah. My answer is I think we need to be very careful about what we're doing right now. And if I was a landlord, I wouldn't be evicting anybody. I just don't think it's the right time to be doing that. And I don't know what courts are going to say about that on the other side of this. I mean, it's one thing if you had a delinquent tenant before COVID, but if you had a tenant that was paying their rent and now, like, let's take a hair salon, for example, like paying their rent, doing great, all of a sudden they're not able to open. They can't even really do curbside pickup. You know, the majority of their sales is not coming from the shampoo and mascara and whatever that they're selling. The majority of the sales is coming from their hair care that they're doing in the salon, right? So now they have no way to get any money. So 3-4 months from now, on the other side of this, they're going to be very busy. Everyone's going to want to go get their hair done, right? Everybody. So they're going to be flourishing. So why would you not just defer that rent? Why would you default them, put them through more hardship? Like, one of the rules of court in Canada that I absolutely love is, go into court with clean hands. Have done the right thing, and that's the important thing, right? So there's no precedent for this. This is unprecedented times, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But I think anybody that fires an employee right now or evicts a tenant or anything like that is going to be dragged into court with unclean hands, and the judge is probably not going to look favorable upon them.
Okay, we'll give it another minute if there's any more questions. Okay, well, thank you very much, Katherine, for coming in and presenting this morning. I think it was a very beneficial webinar, and I think a lot of people got a lot of information out of it. As you can see, Katherine has her contact information up on the screen. If you have any other questions, please contact Katherine, or you can contact the Chamber of Commerce. This is Ashley speaking. My email is events@miltonchamber.ca. Thank you again for attending, and we wish everyone a great day. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Oh, sorry about that. I also forgot. I will be posting this recording up on the Chamber website for anybody who would like to review it for the slide deck. And we will also be doing another webinar in this series. So stay tuned to your emails or the Milton Chamber of Commerce events page for upcoming webinars in the COVID Conversations series. Take care.